Refracting the past through prisms of the present is, dare I say, a perennial practice in any cultural tradition. This is the work of memory. In religious traditions, there are strong tendencies to fancy that our ancestors engaged in the very contemplative techniques and spiritual states that we find most revelatory today. Late ancient rabbis depicted biblical patriarchs as laying tefillin and davening the contemporary liturgies, Merkavah mystics who gleaned visions and wisdom through gazing upon the surfaces of water. Imagine that Ezekiel beheld the chariot precisely because he was there al Nahar Kvar, upon the river Kvar. The medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides sensed that Moses cognized God through metaphysical meditations, while Maimonides' son, Abraham, remembered Moses as employing his own community's potent practices of Sufi spirituality. In the 1990s, countless Jubus portrayed prophets and sages as masters of mindfulness. This is all memory. It's worth considering Jewish psychedelia in this vein. In recent generations, entheogenic experiences have served as lenses through which Jews, among others, have contemplated traditional sources. For reasons beyond the scope of this brief presentation, Hasidic sources have been a special hotspot. I want to think about two different modes of entheogenic memories about Hasidism. First, there's the historical variety of entheogenic memory. Here, folks claim that Hasidic mysticism might have, or must have, erupted through ingestions of psychoactive substances. For example, there was that 1998 article in the Israel Journal of Psychiatry suggesting that an 18th century Eastern European efflorescence of ergot, the psychoactive fungus that spawned LSD, affected poor Jews in particular through their disproportionate consumption of what else? Rye grain, and thereby contributed to the outbreak of Hasidism. There are also claims about more intentional practices of the founder of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov. Quote, what the Besht had smoked in his famous pipe when he wandered in seclusion through the Carpathian Mountains was something a lot more potent than tobacco, mused members of Chavarat Shalom in Somerville, Massachusetts in the 1960s counterculture. Or as declared in the 2009 book aptly entitled Cannabis Hasidus, quote, we have a tradition of dope smoking in Hasidus pretty much from its inception, end quote. The author refers as well to a dude in Brooklyn who allegedly possessed the Besh pipe and a Chabadnik in Marin County who claimed that testing was done on the pipe in question and it did have marijuana resins in it. Now, to my knowledge, there is no clear evidence to support such claims, and this only makes the discourse itself all the more intriguing. What do such narratives say about our own era? For now, I'll just say this. The European Enlightenment fueled a massive repression of spiritual techniques and mystical maps. Although Christians were at the helm of this rationalist revolution, calls to transform religious traditions from hyper-emotional, ecstatic, effeminate superstitions to truly enlightened religions of reason exerted especially acute pressure on Jews, particularly Western European Jews, as minority groups who had to demonstrate their worthiness for citizenship and civil rights in modern liberal states. Centuries of Kabbalistic practices were consciously suppressed, and meanwhile, those Oriental Hasidim back east were cast as the antithesis of enlightenment. With remarkable rapidity, mystical techniques and know-how receded from huge swaths of the Ashkenazi Jewish cultural consciousness. And in such a state of enlightened amnesia, when confronted with Hasidic testimonies of visions and dissolutions, what else can one say but the Hasidim must have been tripping? Forgetfulness is thus itself an integral component of memory, writes Elliot Wolfson. For what's remembered is only remembered against the background of what is forgotten. Collective memory, no less than individual memory, is shaped as much by what is forgotten as by what is remembered, end quote. In addition to this historical variety of entheogenic memory, there's also a hermeneutical or interpretive mode, which is somewhat subtler and it seems to me far more common. This approach does not necessarily wage claims about ancestral ingestions of psychedelics. Rather, there's a sense that psychedelic experiences somehow illuminate the depths of Jewish sources and vice versa. In other words, the hermeneutical strain of entheogenic memory imagines that psychedelic experiences grant us firsthand insights into the experiential headwaters of traditional sources, which then lets those sources speak to us more deeply and even in entirely new ways, both as mirrors and maps for our own journeys. Per usual, hermeneutics and phenomenology go hand in hand here. Interpretations always draw upon experiences, and experiences are always already interpretive. Of course, there's still a historical claim embedded in this hermeneutical dimension, however implicit it may be. After all, if I sense that my mushroom trip helps me understand early Hasidic articulations of dveikut, or flushness with divinity, then I'm probably assuming that early Hasidic experiences of dveikut resembled my experience on mushrooms. This is a phenomenological historical claim rather than a material historical one, but a historical claim nonetheless. I'm still refracting the past through the prisms of my present. I'm observing the traditional practice of memory. That said, the hermeneutical branch of entheogenic memory can take quite nuanced forms. As an example, I want to turn to Zalman Schachter Shalomi, known affectionately as Reb Zalman, a foundational figure in 20th century American Jewish spirituality. Born in Poland in 1924, Zalman was living as a Chabad Chassid in 1963 when he tripped on LSD for the first time at a Massachusetts ashram with Timothy Leary. The unpublished transcript of this oral trip report, delivered extemporaneously to a group of rabbis, brims with citational froth at the whirling nexus of LSD and Hasidism. In fact, Zalman assigns the group to read the Baal Shem Tov's own testimony about his Aliyat Hanshama, his ascent of the soul, as preparation for hearing Zalman's trip report. In the 21-page typescript, Zalman never even hints at a possibility that the Besht or any other early Hasidim ingested psychedelic substances. Rather, he plunges into the hermeneutical stream of entheogenic memory, and he does so with considerable nuance. Taking for granted the history I outlined earlier about the suppression of mystical techniques in liberal Jewish spheres, Zalman suggests that a related amnesia actually took place within Hasidism itself, albeit for different reasons. According to his assessment, when the movement shifted in the 19th century from ragtag rebbes training their disciples for revelatory arts, to more dynastic structures of institutionalization, Hasidism gradually lost the, quote, pneumatic keys that early sages had transmitted to disciples in order to both launch them and help them navigate the more far-out reaches of mystical exploration. Given this vacuum, a question that Zalman sought to explore in his trip was, can LSD offer a pneumatic key in some way that might help him, as a Hasid, attain what the Besht called an ascent of the soul, if not other modes of spiritual connection in his lineage? There is so much to say about how Zalman articulated the results of this experiment, and I'm doing other work on that, or check it out. But I want to highlight just a few key points for now. On one hand, Zalman did sense some deep phenomenological correlations between LSD and Hasidic states. At times during the trip itself, he felt this to be true in strikingly perennialist ways. For example, I'm quoting him from his report. I started to dance with him, Leary, and I said, ugh, this is great. How much fasting would one have to do in order to get there, you know? How much sensory deprivation to be able to get oneself into with a mere sip like this? How great, how inexpensive. This is great. This is the greatest thing that ever happened, end quote. Likewise, Zalman marvels at how LSD unearthed the semiotic core of Hasidic sources. Quote, you know, all Mises, Hasidic tales, came true at that point, and what's really alive and a symbol made all kinds of sense, he marvels in his trip report. And yet, Zalman does not proclaim any direct equivalence between LSD mind and Hasidic modes of consciousness. In fact, he ultimately affirms differences between them, especially in his original unpublished testimony. Was it an aliyat hanshama, he asks? Was it in the sense of the soul? I would have sworn that it was, while still under the influence. Now I wouldn't swear to it, he says. For example, he describes how his LSD experience lacked elements of destination and kedusha, or holiness. It didn't feel Jewish enough for him. He felt no real Shabbos with LSD, no real Sabbath with LSD. It swept him up to the point of losing all agency and intention in his practice that night. And yet, even as he enumerates these phenomenological differences between LSD and what he understands to be Hasidic modes of consciousness, in the very same breath, he turns and returns to Hasidic sources to navigate this very terrain. And that strikes me as key. Ultimately, he's downright enthralled by what it was like to engage with Jewish tradition through the lens of LSD. In other words, his takeaway was not, wow, these are the very psycho-spiritual grounds from which Hasidic sources sprung, but rather, wow, these are wildly fertile grounds for contemplating those sources. Zalman describes these textures of cognition with Thomas Mann's German term Sinnen, which undoubtedly hit Zalman's ears with Yiddish valences, and which he defines to his friends as, quote, not quite thinking, not discursive, not logical, not feeling, but total preoccupation with an idea. He continually marvels at how through this lens, every letter and word, image and expression of the tradition is olam umloyo, a whole world teeming unto itself, a force field that utterly consumes consciousness, destroys and heals, exposes the nothing in everything and the everything in nothing. And he says, near the end of his report, we need to train Jewish spiritual directors in the LSD experience, put our texts to use. What I would want to do if I have the opportunity again is to control it in the steeple setting, the Hasidic prayer space. But I would also want to have someone who is going to be the ground control, to keep on calling attention to some Jewish program, because I was complaining before, saying that LSD took hold of me and I had nothing to do with it. Maybe we ought to make a sacrament out of it, to be administered, as it were, in shul, synagogue, under given situations with certain things, end quote. For Zalman, the religious purpose of psychedelics was not so much to rekindle 18th century flames, but to help ignite what he would soon call a new turning of Hasidism. Fixations on recovering old wells can cover up fresh flow beneath one's feet. To remember most luminously demands a thoughtful forgetting so we can remember new things. Thank you.